The wind carried the kind of snow that bit into the skin and clung there, stubborn as a grudge. It swirled around the ridgeline, shrouding the pine-dark slopes in white, until the whole world looked carved from frost and silence. Smoke rose from a lone chimney tucked against the shoulder of the mountain, the cabin standing as if it had been planted there by the hand of the land itself, unmoving, enduring. Inside, a single flame wavered in the hearth, throwing light across rough-hewn walls and the broad back of the man who lived there. Talon Greyhawk was bare-chested despite the cold, his skin bronzed and marked by old scars, muscles moving slow and deliberate as he sharpened the edge of a hunting knife. His hair, black as a raven's wing, hung loose past his shoulders, damp from melting snow. He had been alone here for years, long enough that the habit of speaking felt unnecessary. Words had never been much use to him anyway. The quiet, the work, the sound of the wind, that was the language he trusted. The knock came faintly at first, lost in the howl outside. Then again firmer, as if whoever was at the door feared they would be turned away if they did not insist on being heard. He rose, set the blade aside, and crossed the floor in a few steady strides. When he swung open the door, the snow came in with her. She stood hunched beneath the weight of it, a wool shawl pulled tight, her face pale and windburned. Auburn hair, damp and tangled, clung to her cheeks. She clutched a bundle in both hands. Not a baby, but a bundle of belongings wrapped in faded calico. Her lips were blue, her boots caked in ice. Green eyes met his, steady despite the cold. "You need a wife," she said, her voice flat, as if rehearsed. "And I need shelter." No pleading, no sweetening the words. Just the raw truth of it, laid bare like the wind outside. Her gaze didn't waver, though her knees trembled beneath the skirt. Talon didn't answer right away. He looked at her the way a man studies a trail, reading not only what's visible, but what's been hidden. There was the tired slope to her shoulders, the faint purpling along her cheekbone that the shawl could not hide, the way her hands gripped the bundle, as if it was all she had left in the world. He knew desperation when he saw it. He had lived it himself. Behind her, the snow thickened. A few more minutes and she'd vanish into it. He stepped aside. She hesitated only a second before crossing the threshold. The cabin swallowed her up, its warmth, its smell of wood smoke and pine pitch, and she stopped just inside, snow melting in damp streaks down her skirt. She didn't look at him again right away, instead scanning the single room. A table with 2 chairs. A bed against the far wall. Hooks lined with furs and a rifle resting above the hearth. Simple, functional, without the clutter of another life. "Sit," Talon said, the first word he'd given her. She obeyed, lowering herself into the nearest chair. Her bundle thumped softly onto the table, and she pulled her shawl free, laying it over the backrest. "You've been walking long?" he asked. "Since yesterday morning." Her fingers worked at the edge of the shawl, smoothing it though it needed no smoothing. There wasn't anywhere else. Talon took a mug from the shelf and poured her hot water from the kettle. He had no tea to spare, but the heat alone seemed to loosen the stiffness in her jaw. She sipped without thanks, though her eyes softened at the first swallow. "What's your name?" he asked. "Dorothy May Calloway." She set the mug down gently. "Widow." He nodded once, as if that explained everything. And in a place like this maybe it did. Women didn't travel alone in winter, unless driven by something colder than snow. "You live here alone?" she asked. "Yes." "And you're Apache?" His eyes flickered toward her, gauging whether it was curiosity or judgment behind the question. She held his gaze without flinching. "Yes," he said again. The wind rattled the window. A loose shutter banged once and then stilled. Outside, the snow kept falling, sealing the world in white. "You can stay," he said at last, "until the storm passes." Her chin lifted, though her voice stayed even. "I meant what I said. I'm not looking for a few days. I'm looking for a place to stay. For good." He considered that. She didn't look like a woman with much left to bargain with, but there was a steadiness in her tone that carried more weight than pleading would have. She was here because every other door had shut. His answer was a single nod. They did not speak much after that. She shed her coat, revealing a faded calico dress patched at the hem. While he added another log to the fire, she unwrapped her bundle. 2 dresses, a pair of stockings, and a Bible worn at the edges. Nothing else. It was the life of someone who had learned to live light, ready to run. Talon busied himself at the hearth, stirring the pot of beans he'd left there earlier. He ladled a portion into a bowl and set it before her. She ate without comment, as if conversation was too expensive to spend. He ate standing, looking out the small window toward the line of trees that blurred in the snow. When she'd finished, she thanked him, quiet, almost reluctant, and he took the bowl without reply. She sat by the fire after that, warming her hands, eyes half closed as the heat began to sink in. He noticed the way her shoulders slowly uncurled, the way the fine tremor in her fingers eased. Later, when the light began to dim, he took down an extra blanket from the shelf and handed it to her. She spread it over the narrow bed without question, as if she already knew she'd be sleeping there. Talon laid out his own bedroll on the floor near the hearth. The storm pressed closer around the cabin, the wind howling through the pines like something alive. Talon sat on the floor, knife in hand, carving the smooth handle of a new bough. Dorothy lay still in the bed, eyes open, watching the flames dance. She didn't ask him anything more. He didn't tell her anything more. They were 2 people who understood that sometimes silence was the safest ground. Outside, the snow covered their tracks until it was as though she had not walked there at all. But she had. And in the quiet between them, something unspoken had already begun. The mornings in Talon's cabin began without words. The storm had not lifted, and each day the light came slow, filtered through the snow mist clinging to the pines. Dorothy rose early, her breath still visible in the chill before the fire caught. She moved with quiet efficiency, feeding the embers, setting the kettle, mending what could be mended. It was work she understood, small tasks that kept the hours from collapsing in on themselves. Talon would be gone before the first steam rose from the kettle, slipping out into the pale half-light with his bow or rifle slung across his back. He never said where he was going. When he returned, it was with the smell of the outside still on him. Pine resin, cold metal, the faint musk of whatever he'd tracked. Sometimes he brought back meat, sometimes only more wood, his arms stacked high with split logs that he dropped by the hearth without a word. She cooked for them both. He never asked her to, but neither did he stop her. The beans stretched with cornmeal, the coffee was thin but hot. He ate in the same steady way he did everything, and when she set an extra biscuit on his plate, he didn't thank her but did not leave it untouched. One afternoon, while she sat stitching a tear in her skirt, she asked, "Why here? Why live in this cabin, away from town?" He glanced up from sharpening a hatchet, dark eyes unreadable. "Because I don't belong in town." "Don't or won't?" He considered, then returned to the blade. "Both." The answer wasn't enough to satisfy her curiosity, but she knew better than to press. She had her own reasons for keeping parts of herself locked away. There was safety in knowing when not to ask. On the 3rd day, the snow thinned enough for her to see the valley below from the small window. Talon hitched up his coat, one of the few times she'd seen him wear more than his bare skin and the leather around his waist, and told her he was going to check the traplines. She asked to go with him. He looked at her as though weighing something invisible between them, then handed her a wool scarf. "Stay close." They walked through the muffled forest, snow crunching beneath their boots. He moved without hesitation, as if every tree and shadow was a landmark. She tried to match his pace but found herself lagging when the wind cut sharper. He didn't comment, but once when she stumbled in a drift, he offered his arm. She took it, felt the unyielding strength beneath the worn fabric, and let go as soon as she'd steadied herself. They found 3 rabbits in the traps, each dispatched quickly and cleanly. On the way back, she asked if the townsfolk ever came up this way. "No," he said, eyes fixed on the trail. "They talk enough about me without needing to see me." Her stomach tightened. She'd felt that talk already, even in the brief time she'd been in town before finding his cabin. Whispers that prickled the skin, laughter that wasn't kind. The next day, she walked down to the general store alone, needing to trade some of her last possessions, a small silver brooch, for salt and flour. Ezekiel Boone was behind the counter, his smile too wide to be friendly. "Didn't expect to see you back here so soon," he said, eyes flicking over her. "Word is you've taken up with the Greyhawk." She kept her chin level. "I'm staying at his cabin. That's all." Boone leaned forward, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "That's not all people are saying." Her grip on the brooch tightened until her knuckles went white. She made her purchase quickly, ignoring the two women by the stove who whispered behind their hands. She could feel their eyes on her back as she left. When she returned to the cabin, Talon was stacking wood outside. She set the supplies down inside and busied herself with storing them, hoping the tightness in her chest would ease. But when she looked out the window, he was watching her, not with curiosity, but with a kind of steady awareness. He didn't ask, and she didn't tell him. Instead, he took up the axe and began splitting wood with deliberate force, each strike ringing like a quiet promise that no one would come between them and safety. That night, they sat by the fire, the quiet stretching between them, until it felt almost like comfort. She found herself speaking before she could stop. "People in town think things about me. About you." His gaze didn't waver from the flames. "Let them. You don't care." He shook his head once. "I've lived too long to waste breath on their words." She studied him, wondering what it would take to build that kind of armor. Wondering if she could. As the days passed, small changes took root. She no longer hesitated before taking her seat at the table. He left his bow near the door where she could see it, a subtle reminder that he was ready for whatever might come. They worked side by side to patch the roof where snowmelt had started to creep in. In the evenings, she read aloud from her Bible, her voice soft in the warm dark, and though he didn't seem like a man who cared much for scripture, he listened without interruption. One evening, as she set a loaf to cool, she caught him watching her. Not in the way other men had, with hunger or appraisal, but as if trying to memorize her shape in the firelight. It startled her more than if he'd spoken. She busied herself with cutting slices, placing one before him without comment. Outside, the snow still lay thick, but the sky had cleared enough to let the moon spill across the hills. She stood at the doorway a long time, wrapped in her shawl, watching the silver light touch the pines. Behind her, she heard him moving, checking the locks, banking the fire. Small, unspoken things that said she was not just passing through. By the time she lay down to sleep, the warmth of the cabin had soaked into her bones. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in many months, she did not dream of running. The nights grew longer, as if winter meant to stretch its reach into every waking hour. The snow outside no longer fell in frantic storms but in quiet, steady veils, sealing the world in a hush that made every sound inside the cabin feel sharper. Dorothy had begun to sleep more deeply, though some nights the past still reached for her. The first time Talon heard it, he'd been mending a broken snowshoe near the fire. A faint, stifled sound, too soft for a cry, too raw for a sigh, came from the bed. She lay on her side, eyes closed, her shoulders trembling. He didn't speak. Instead, he set aside his work and tended the fire until the flames rose high, letting the warmth swell in the room until her breathing slowed. Only when she had gone still again did he return to his task. She woke the next morning without mention of it, though her eyes lingered on him longer than usual over breakfast. That unspoken thread between them was stronger now, woven not of words but of moments they allowed each other to keep. A week later, she asked to go to town for supplies. He didn't answer at once, merely studied her face. "I'll go with you," he said finally. They walked the snow-packed road in silence, his stride measured to match hers. When they entered the general store, the room went quieter than it should have. Eyes shifted toward them. Ezekiel Boone stood behind the counter, his grin polite enough to be false. "Mr. Greyhawk." "Mrs. Calloway," Boone said, though the title felt like a needle slid beneath Dorothy's skin. She asked for flour, coffee, and lamp oil. Boone fetched them, but not before adding, "Haven't seen the two of you apart since she turned up at your place." Talon didn't respond, but the air between them changed, thickened. He stood just behind Dorothy, and though he didn't touch her, she felt the quiet weight of him at her back. Boone looked from one to the other, his smirk faltering slightly under the stillness in Talon's eyes. When they stepped outside, Dorothy exhaled the breath she'd been holding. "You didn't have to come," she said. I did, he replied. Back at the cabin, she unpacked the supplies while he went to stack more wood. Through the small window, she watched him work, each movement efficient, deliberate. He was a man who knew the value of labor, of things built with patience. She wondered what it might feel like to be built into someone's life that way, not just as shelter from a storm, but as something intended to stay. The snow began to soften around the edges of winter, though spring was still far off. More animals prowled the tree line at night, and Talon kept his rifle near the door. One evening, just after sunset, a sound rose from the woods, long, low, and not entirely from any beast she knew. Dorothy paused at the hearth, ladle in hand, listening. Wolves? She asked. His glance toward the window was quick. Coyotes. Hungry. She returned to stirring the pot, but the thought of thin, desperate shapes moving in the dark left her unsettled. That night, the unease followed her into sleep, twisting her dreams. She saw the face of her late husband, not softened by death, but as he had been alive, eyes sharp with cruelty. In the dream, he reached for her, his hands cold, and she woke with a gasp. The fire had burned low. Talon was already awake, sitting at the table, his profile lit by the last embers. Bad dreams, he said, not as a question. She nodded. They don't leave me. He didn't offer comfort, only met her gaze with a steadiness that felt like the closest thing to it. They get quieter, he said. Not gone. Quieter. The next morning, she mended one of his shirts without being asked, running the needle through the worn fabric with small, precise stitches. When he came in from the cold, she handed it to him without comment. He looked at it, then at her, and slipped it on as though it had always been his. Days later, Sheriff Cole Hensley arrived on horseback, his badge catching the winter light. Dorothy stiffened when she saw him approach, but Talon opened the door before the sheriff could knock. Evening, Cole said, adjusting his gloves. Some folks are uneasy. Word is certain men don't think Mrs. Calloway belongs up here with you. Talon's jaw flexed once. She belongs where she's safe. The sheriff nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. Keep it that way. He tipped his hat toward Dorothy, then rode off, leaving the snow to close behind him. She stood in the doorway, shawl pulled tight, watching the figure vanish into the pines. They won't stop, will they? She said quietly. No, Talon answered. But they'll learn. That night, she lingered by the fire, not ready to sleep. He was whittling a new bough, the shavings curling at his feet. She asked if he'd ever been married. He shook his head. She didn't press, but the answer settled between them, heavy as snow on the roof. Outside, the world was all white and shadow, and inside, the air between them carried the first faint heat of something that had nothing to do with the fire. It was in the way he looked up when she moved, the way her hand almost brushed his when she set his cup on the table. Neither of them said a word about it. But the silence was changing. The storm came sudden and without mercy. By late afternoon, the wind howled through the trees with the voice of something ancient, flinging snow sideways in long, blinding gusts. The sky was already black by the time Dorothy lit the lamps. Talon had gone out that morning to hunt, saying he'd be back before nightfall, but the wind had swallowed the sound of his steps long before she closed the door behind him. She kept the fire high, feeding it with the split logs he'd left stacked neatly by the hearth. The snow rattled against the shutters, and every so often the wind struck the cabin with a deep, shuddering groan. Dorothy busied herself with small tasks, stirring the pot, folding the blanket at the foot of the bed, checking the latch on the door. She told herself he would return soon. When the knock came, it wasn't his. It was hard and quick, the kind of knock that wanted entry, not welcome. Her heart jolted. She hesitated only a moment before crossing the room and lifting the latch. 3 men stood on the threshold, the snow clinging to their coats and hats, their breath steaming in the bitter air. She knew the one in front before he spoke. Samuel Calloway, her late husband's older brother. His narrow eyes swept over her, then past her into the cabin. "Well," he said, voice thick with contempt. "Ain't this something? My brother's widow, holed up with an Apache in the hills." The other 2 men shifted behind him, boots grinding in the snow. One was broad in the shoulders, the other wiry, both with the kind of restless energy that meant trouble. Dorothy's grip on the door tightened. "You shouldn't be here." Samuel's smile was all teeth. "I think I should. You've got no business up here. You belong with family. And that child you're carrying." His gaze dropped deliberately to her midsection. "That's Calloway blood. I aim to see it raised right." She stepped back, her stomach tightening. "I'm not going anywhere with you." He pushed forward, the heel of his hand on the door. "Don't think you've got a choice." The other men followed him in, tracking Snow across the plank floor. The warmth of the cabin shrank under the weight of their presence, the fire's glow casting their shadows long across the walls. "You think this," Samuel gestured toward the room, "is a life? Out here with a half-wild savage? Folks in town are already talking." Dorothy's throat was dry, but her voice came steady. "Let them talk." His eyes hardened. "You're coming now, before that Indian gets back." She moved toward the table, keeping it between them. "You should leave." The wind rattled the door she'd left ajar. Then, through the roar of the storm, another sound, a softer, heavier tread, entered the room like a held breath. Talon stood in the doorway, snow steaming off his bare shoulders, a bough gripped loosely in his left hand. His hair was wet with melted frost, his eyes dark and fixed on the three men inside his cabin. Samuel straightened but didn't step back. "Well, speak of the devil," he said, though his voice lacked the easy swagger it had held a moment before. Talon said nothing. He closed the door against the wind, the click of the latch loud in the silence. Then he crossed the room until he stood between Dorothy and the intruders, the firelight turning the planes of his face to bronze and shadow. Samuel shifted his weight, squaring his stance. "We've come for her. She's kin. You've got no right." Talon's voice was low, even. "She's here because she wants to be. That's not for you to decide." The room tightened, the only sound the crackle of the fire, and the faint whistle of the wind outside. Talon's stillness was more dangerous than motion, an animal waiting, measuring the distance between threat and strike. "You'll leave," he said at last, "and you won't come back." One of the other men laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Or what?" Talon didn't answer with words. His bow came up, the arrow already notched, the movement so smooth it seemed to happen without time passing between thought and action. The firelight caught on the arrowhead, a cold glint. The laugh died. Samuel's jaw tightened. He looked from Talon to Dorothy, and something in her gaze, steady, unflinching, must have told him the rest. He jerked his head toward the door. "Let's go." The three men stepped back into the storm, swallowed almost instantly by the white roar outside. Talon lowered the bow, set it on the table, and closed the door with deliberate care. Dorothy let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You didn't have to," she began, but stopped. She didn't know how to finish the sentence. "I did," he said simply. She stood there, the heat of the fire at her back and the lingering cold of the storm at her front, and understood, without him saying it, that her safety had been claimed. Not as property, not as debt, but as something worth guarding. Outside, the wind raged on. Inside, the cabin was still, save for the low hum of the fire, the faint smell of snow melting from his skin, and the knowledge that this was no longer just shelter. It was a line drawn. The storm did not pass quickly. For 2 days, the wind screamed through the trees, pushing drifts against the cabin walls until the windows were half buried. Talon kept to his work, checking the traps, chopping wood, mending the small things that could not be left for spring. Dorothy moved quietly between the hearth and the table, cooking what little they had, stitching tears in garments, keeping the fire alive. They spoke little, but something in the air had shifted. He had stood between her and danger. She had looked at him without flinching. The memory hung in the room like the scent of pine smoke, faint but inescapable. By the third morning, the wind eased, though the cold still bit sharp as a blade. Talon went out early, leaving tracks that disappeared into the white woods. Dorothy was alone when she heard it. A crunch of boots outside, too many for one man, and then the low murmur of voices. She set down the knife she'd been using to cut bread and went to the window. Shapes emerged through the thinning veil of snow. Samuel Calloway, and not just the two men from before but four more besides, all bundled in rough coats, rifles slung at their sides. The sight froze her where she stood. The first knock rattled the door on its hinges. The second came harder. She backed away, heart pounding, eyes darting to Talon's bow in the corner. Before she could reach for it, the latch lifted. They stepped in without invitation, crowding the small cabin with their presence, the smell of cold and unwashed wool spilling in with them. Samuel's smile was colder than the wind outside. "Told you I'd be back." "You need to leave," Dorothy said, forcing her voice to be steady. He ignored her, scanning the room. "Where's your guardian?" "Out in the woods." "That's a shame. Could have settled this quicker." His gaze swept over her, lingering too long. "You'll come with us now, before you end up with a half-breed brat in your arms." Her hands curled into fists at her sides. She thought of Talon's stillness, his unspoken promises. She thought of the quiet dignity he wore like armor, and how she had begun to want some of it for herself. "No," she said. The word landed heavy in the small room. Samuel's expression darkened. "You think you can defy me?" The sound came from behind them, a single, deliberate step on the wooden porch. The men turned as Talon filled the doorway, snow steaming from his bare skin, a rifle in one hand, a knife at his belt. His eyes moved from face to face, measuring, weighing, deciding. Samuel smirked, though his shoulders stiffened. "We're taking her." Talon's voice was low, carrying through the air like the rumble of distant thunder. "You're leaving." One of the new men stepped forward, hand on his rifle. "Or maybe you are." The silence that followed was a taut wire. Then it snapped. Talon moved first, crossing the space between them with a speed that didn't seem possible in such a large frame. The butt of his rifle slammed into the man's chest, sending him sprawling into the table. Dorothy flinched as another lunged forward, but Talon was already turning, the knife flashing in his hand, not to cut, but to catch the man's sleeve and twist, sending his weapon clattering to the floor. The cabin erupted into chaos. The fire roared in the hearth, casting wild shadows against the walls as bodies collided. Dorothy grabbed the bow from the corner, knocking an arrow with hands that trembled but did not falter. She held it aimed at Samuel, whose eyes widened just slightly at the sight of her. "You won't shoot," he sneered. Her voice was quiet, even. "Try me." Behind him, one of his men went down under Talon's weight, the air driven from his lungs with a choked cry. Another scrambled for the door, stumbling into the snow outside. Samuel hesitated, just a flicker of uncertainty, but in that space Talon was there, his shadow falling over them both. His hand closed on Samuel's coat, hauling him back from Dorothy, and the two men stood face to face. "You come here again," Talon said, each word sharp and measured. "And you won't walk away." He shoved Samuel toward the door. The others followed, limping, swearing under their breath. None looked back once they crossed the threshold. Talon closed the door behind them, bolting it. The cabin was suddenly still, save for the sound of the fire and Dorothy's own breathing. She lowered the bow slowly, her arms aching from the tension. "You all right?" he asked, his voice softer now. She nodded, though the heat behind her eyes surprised her. "You came back." "I said I would." He set his rifle aside and stepped closer. She could see the steam rising from his skin, the marks of the fight already darkening across his shoulders. Without thinking, she reached up, brushing her fingers against one of the bruises. His breath caught, though he didn't pull away. "You didn't have to fight for me," she murmured. "I did," he said simply, the same way he had that night in the storm. Something in her chest shifted then. Some piece of herself she'd kept walled away for years loosening in the heat between them. She let her hand fall, but her gaze stayed on his. "I'm staying. If you'll have me." His answer came not in words but in the small, certain curve of his mouth, the first real smile she'd seen from him. Spring did not come quickly to the hills. Weeks passed before the snow thinned enough to let the earth breathe again. When they went to town together for the first time since that day, the stairs were there, but softer. Martha Green nodded at Dorothy in quiet approval. Sheriff Cole tipped his hat to them both. Even Ezekiel Boone held his tongue. They left the store with their supplies, walking side by side down the thawing road. The air smelled of pine and wet earth. Talon's hand brushed hers once, not by accident, and she didn't move away. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose. Dorothy stood at the threshold, looking out at the hills. She thought of the first night she had stood there, half frozen, clutching her bundle, and of the man who had stepped aside to let her in. Sometimes, she thought, home was not a place you found. It was a place someone made for you, plank by plank, gesture by gesture, until you belonged there as much as the walls did. If you're listening to this wherever you are, remember, love doesn't always arrive with grand words or perfect timing. Sometimes it comes in the sound of boots in the snow, in the quiet presence of someone who stands between you and the storm. And when it does, you hold on to it. Because winters are long, but the fire you tend together will outlast them.